One of the biggest stories of the current presidential campaign is the fundraising success of Texas Governor George W. Bush. The GOP frontrunner is not alone in filling his campaign war chest to the brim. In fact, this year's election is already one for the record books, the most expensive presidential race in history, with the general election still ahead. At the rate it's going, Election Day 2000 could bring to the White House the nation's first $200 million president. Well, many observers believe that we have a serious problem, that big money threatens to steamroll any semblance of open democracy, and that the highest office in the land may be for sale to the highest bidder. Hello, I'm John Molesky of the Close-Up Foundation. Welcome to the Newseum in Arlington, Virginia, for this week's Close-Up at the Newseum discussion of campaign financing. Our guests are Charles Lewis, Executive Director of the Center for Public Integrity, a nonpartisan organization renowned for its in-depth investigative reporting. Previously, Mr. Lewis was an investigative reporter for ABC and CBS and was a producer for 60 Minutes. He is the founder of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and speaks to reporters around the world on ethics-related issues. Larry Makinson is the Executive Director of the Center for Responsive Politics, an organization that conducts research on Congress and related issues with special emphasis on campaign finance. Mr. Makinson is a pioneer of computer-assisted reporting on money and politics. He set up his first database when he was a reporter for the Anchorage Daily News in Alaska back in 1985. The students you'll hear from today are in Washington to take part in the Close-Up Foundation's week-long government studies program, and we'll hear their questions and comments in just a moment. But first, we'll hear from our guests. And gentlemen, before we delve into our subject matter, perhaps you could provide our students and our viewers with some information on your respective organizations. And Charles, if we can begin with you.
Sure. The Center for Public Integrity is a group of expatriate journalists who want to investigate things thoroughly, and sometimes we take 1 or 2 years to look at a single topic. We've done 40 reports in 10 years, nonpartisan. We alienate people on both sides of the aisle, a nonprofit group. We just did a book, The Buying of the President 2000.
Now, was the reason that people get out of mainstream journalism and join your crusade because they can't find a media outlet that invests enough in investigative reporting?
Well, it's true. We just had a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner, 30-year veteran, join us, and he can sink his teeth into a subject for months and months. No one is bugging him to go cover a sex scandal or, you know, some
JonBenet Ramsey.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a lot of that. I think it's seen as an oasis in the current desert of journalism, I think.
Larry, tell us about the Center for Responsive Politics.
Well, it sounds like the name of a front group, but in fact it's not. We're also...
What are you really about? Come on,
we're really about tracking the money in politics. What we do is every month we take the contribution records from the Federal Election Commission. All candidates for federal office, the parties and so on, have to file that. And we go through all those records and we try to categorize them by industry and interest group and gradually build up a portfolio of where an individual candidate is getting his money, his or her money, where members of Congress are getting the money, how much money the defense committees or defense companies are putting into the defense committees, this sort of thing. And we show the whole thing on a website called opensecrets.org, where you can actually dial in your zip code and find out who's giving in your neighborhood. You can look up the candidates for public office and find out who they're beholden to, who their cash constituents are. We basically provide information which, again, like Chuck's organization, news organizations really don't have the background or the time or in many cases the interest to do it, but they sure appreciate it, the fact that we can do it and that information can be available.
And you're talking about top to bottom, from the highest office in the land down to local races?
Well, down to the congressional level. And we have a number of states, particularly in the Midwest. Now on our website we have about 10 states up. We're hoping to have about 40. There's a group that does much of what we do called the Institute for Money and State Politics. A National Institute on Money and State Politics, and we've got their data on our website as well in many states.
Okay. Getting into the problem, if you think it's a problem, or defining the problem, this book, The Buying of the President, you mentioned, your new book, The Buying of the President 2000, plug time, I feel like Jay Leno here or something like that. This book suggests before you vote, find out who's really bankrolling the candidates and what they expect in return. Is this typical book cover hype, or do you really believe that we're talking about selling the highest office in the land?
Well, anyone who runs for president has to raise $30 million or more the year before the election. You don't raise $300,000 a day from backyard bake sales and barbecues. You're raising it from people that want something from government. And a narrow sliver of our society, 0.1%, writes a check for $1,000. And so it's important to know who's behind these candidates. These candidates have gotten close to certain powerful interests, and that's the price of power in this democracy. And what it means is a lot of good people don't enter politics. We had 5 Republican presidential candidates quit the race last summer, not because anyone voted against them, it's because they didn't have enough, they only had a few $1 million, they didn't have 30 million. And so 9/10 of all the money that's given the presidential candidates is given the year before the election. And so you have a referendum, a private referendum of the most powerful interests in this country deciding who our choices will be. And we end up with the final choices by the time Iowa and New Hampshire and the primaries come. And in 1998, 92 House races were uncontested. They couldn't find anyone to go out and raise the money to run against the incumbents. I mean, we have a problem here in this country.
So focusing on Governor Bush, it's following your theory, it sounds like
Sure.
what happened is the investors decided he was the guy. He
Right.
was labeled the front runner before a single vote was cast anywhere in the country.
That's
And then
right.
so it sounds like in this equation what the voters become is either we validate what the investors have put in front of us or we reject it.
Well, that's right. In every presidential election since 1976, the candidate raising the most money the year before the election and being eligible for matching funds has gotten the nomination of his party every single time. That's pretty amazing. That's over 25 years approximately. So the 2 candidates raising the most money were Gore and Bush, and here they are, and we're going to be talking about them for the next 6 months between now and November. And yeah, the voter is left with those 2 people as their primary principal choices. The average person, Larry has come up with a statistic, 96% of the American people don't give a penny to any politician at the federal level. So the people sponsoring our politicians are a narrow group in our society, and that's how it works.
How do you factor in the self-funded candidates, the billionaires, whether it's Ross Perot or Steve Forbes or Pete DuPont, people like that?
Right.
They come in without having any investors having quite a large war chest. Why don't they succeed as much as, say, a George Bush or an Al Gore?
Well, I don't know exactly why, but you're absolutely right. They don't succeed. Forbes spent 60 or 70 million over 2 election cycles. I think part of it is when you are forced to raise thousands of $1,000 contributions around the nation, you are forced to create an organization. You also then have the money to make that organization, of course, and to hire people. But if you're just writing a check, then there's no grassroots organization that's occurring at all. And yeah, sure, you can get one of those big recreation vehicles and have people all wearing the same color shirt and go around Iowa, but that's not the same, I
Using
think.
your ATM card is not a grassroots building activity.
Exactly.
Larry, talk about races other than the presidency. How widespread is this problem of large money beginning to dominate?
Well, put it this way, in 1998, the last congressional elections, 96% of the races were won by the candidate who spent the most in the House. It was about 90% in the Senate. In more than half the districts in the country, 250 districts out of 435, it wasn't just a matter of the top spender winning. The top spender spent 10 times as much as the next biggest candidate. In a third of the districts, it was 1,000 to 1. Of a spending disparity. And most of the people getting that money are the incumbents, and most of the people who would like to knock on their doors, would like to challenge them, are people who haven't got a prayer. No matter how many doors they knock on, if you haven't got the money, if you haven't got enough money for voters to know who you are on Election Day, then you are, as you've been talking about here. I mean, is it Election Day or is it Ratification Day? Was the choice made by someone other than the American people? And that's, unfortunately, the effect I think that money's had on our elections.
Is it as clear-cut as your presentation would suggest? I know we're just starting the discussion and there may be shades of gray, but in your view, is it as clear-cut as it's starting to emerge that if you have the biggest piggy bank, you win?
Not all the time, 96% of the time, but I mean, even in races.
Pretty good odds.
Well, that's incumbency as well, which is awfully tough. I mean, 98.3% of House incumbents were reelected in the last election. In 1988, we actually had more people die in office than lost at the polls of the incumbents running for reelection. I mean, this is what elections have become. It's sort of calcified. It's very difficult for new people to come in, and even when you are talking about the new people coming in, even in open seat races, 80% of the time, the person that spent the most won.
Wow. I guess dying in office is a pretty harsh solution to incumbency gridlock. Let me ask you about I remember being a journalism student and having a venerable Jack Anderson as speaker, intoning in those dramatic tones, "Follow the money." What do we find out when we follow the money in these races? Where does it lead?
Well, you find a very direct correlation at the congressional level, between a member's committee assignment in Washington and where the money comes from. Newt Gingrich as famous as he became, and he became Speaker of the House, before he was Speaker of the House, he sat on the Transportation Committee and the Airline Subcommittee. He had more money from airlines than he had from conservative groups, because that's where he was. If you change committees in Congress, go from defense to agriculture, the complexion of your fundraising changes. And the reality is that when you get to Washington, members of Congress understand quite well, and I think this is the case with the President as well as members of Congress, that they've got two sets of constituents that they've got to keep happy. The people back home on the issues that they pay attention to, and the cash constituents, who are probably paying attention to a different set of issues, much more private issues, issues that the candidates aren't going to do spots on, 30-second spots on back in TV. But if they don't pay attention to those guys, there's not going to be any money the next time they want to run for re-election. And so we have an unelected electorate out there, not only picking the candidates, but keeping them in line if they get too far out of line.
Charles, when you follow the money for the presumptive winners of the Democratic and Republican nominations, Mr. Gore and Mr. Bush, what do you find? Who's at the end of that trail?
Well, I mean, the most powerful corporate interests in America are behind both candidates. In the top 25 patrons of Al Gore, the Democrat, there's not a single union, which is kind of interesting. You see things that I guess are not surprising. Oil is a big issue in Texas. Bush is a former oil man. 4 of his top 5 interests have ties to major oil interests. And we then look in the book at the relationship between the governor and those companies, things he has done to help them, etc. Interestingly, the environmental-minded vice president who wrote the book Earth in the Balance is also close to an oil company, Occidental Petroleum. There's a long personal relationship between Gore. His father got a job, $500,000 a year, working for Occidental. There was a land deal involving mining rights where Al Gore Jr. got $300,000. $500,000 or $600,000 has moved from Occidental to the Democratic Party or Gore campaign committees. And oh yes, I should mention, Occidental got rights to oil fields in California that tripled their oil reserves overnight. Gore made the decision. So what I'm getting at is you see these relationships, you see the accommodations to power, how they occur. We know more about our toasters than we do our politicians, even though we get burned by both in this country. This book is an attempt to show you who's doing what behind the scenes.
You know, it sounds so insidious, and it's attractive to American audiences. We like to think in conspiratorial terms and things like that. But I heard a speaker who spoke to close-up teachers, who she was claiming that it's exaggerated the influence of money in Congress, and that if you really want to look at voting records, it's reflective of the 51% of the 50% who voted in any congressional race. How would you respond to that? I know the person's not here directly, but her position being that money lobbying is all exaggerated, that really it's about putting fingers to political wind and finding out what constituents want.
Well, there's 2 different audiences, and you've got to remember that very carefully. I don't think a $1,000 campaign contribution ever changed anyone's vote on an issue like abortion, where the voters are paying attention. But most of what Congress does, and an awful lot of what the President does, are issues basically refereeing between industries, telecommunications policy, banking deregulation, subsidies for agricultural groups, tobacco policy. I mean, these are issues which are being, where the average public is not paying any attention to them, and that's where the money counts. So both if you don't have enough money, you don't get elected, so it affects our elections, but also it affects the complexion of what comes out of Washington. And you may not know today that the bill that had to do with bankruptcy regulation has anything to do with you. But just like the S&L crisis back in the 80s, it may come back to bite you in the end. We sort of get stuck with the bill. I mean, the one question I think you really need to ask is that Jack Anderson question, is the question that came out of Deep Throat in Watergate. You know, follow the money. Ask yourself, who's paying for this election? And then wonder, what are they getting in return after the election is all over? They get something, or they wouldn't be giving that money.
Okay, let's turn to our students.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Lymaster from Hastings, Nebraska, and there's been a lot of talk in the news about Al Gore and fundraising in a Buddhist temple, and I was wondering if you know the truth about it, and if the truth is not good for him, if he could get in trouble for that.
Well, I think there are a lot of questions about the Buddhist monastery incident. The Vice President has not fully discussed what went on there. The truth is it was a fundraising event. When the thing first surfaced, the Vice President said it was not a fundraising event. He called it a community outreach. There's a lot of cute wordplay about what it was and what it wasn't. Later memos come out from inside the vice president's office showing that he knew very clearly he was going to a fundraising event. And the woman who organized it was just recently convicted in federal court, and she's been close to the vice president for the last 10 years. Has the public been told everything? No. Has Gore responded to questions about this? No. Did the FBI ever question the vice president about this? No. That's not a good thing, and I think you're going to see a lot of ads and you're going to see a lot more discussion.
Jonathan, is campaign financing an issue of concern to you?
Yeah, I don't like all the soft money coming sliding underneath the door, and people not like showing credit that they gave the money to the person, just giving it to the party, and then it's directly going to that candidate, and they know which candidate it's going to, and stuff like that.
Do you have a favorite candidate at this point?
Well, actually, I like John McCain, but he's kind of out of the race now. So.
Was part of McCain's appeal his position on?
Yeah, and how he's stern on the issues, and that he doesn't let people shove him around and stuff like that.
I mean, John McCain seemed to be your poster boy for if anybody was going to bring this to the national attention.
He was indeed, and he certainly did bring this issue up, and I think a lot of people, like you, really were affected by that. It's interesting, he had a different campaign finance profile than all the other candidates, including Bush and Gore. Bush and Gore, of all the money they collected, about 75% of it was from people who gave the maximum $1,000 contribution. In John McCain's case, he only got about 35% of his money from people giving the maximum, and he got 30% of his money from people giving under $200, which is quite a remarkable achievement when you're talking about raising tens of millions of dollars. So there was a real difference, not only in what he was saying, but in where his money was coming from, and I think in who he was appealing to. It was reflected in his money. Again, you follow the money and you find that there are.
Did Jerry Brown set a $100 limit?
He did. He did. That's sort of something you can do if people know who you are and if you're not embarrassed about flashing an 800 number in the background every time you speak.
That became comical, of course, in his race, flashing his 800 number everywhere. Thanks, Jonathan. Hi.
Hi, my name's Alyssa and I'm from the state of Illinois. And I was wondering, do you guys believe that there should be a restriction on the amount of money you can use to campaign? Because I believe that if they have a restriction to the amount of money, I think they'll use the money that they have available to them more wisely, and they'd have to be more creative. What do you guys stand on?
This might be an opportunity for you to explain how it works as far as limits and matching funds, eligibility for matching funds, and all those things. Thanks, Alyssa.
Well, that's a great question. There is a big controversy about limiting. There are some reformers that want to have public financing and, in other words, have pretty clear limits established. The Supreme Court has sent mixed signals over the last 30 years about that. If Steve Forbes wants to spend 60 or 70 million of his own money, that is considered his First Amendment right to do so, free speech. But recently the court said that campaign money is property and that it's not free speech and limits are good things. So the court is sending all kinds of confusing signals to the public. I think as long as you have one side raising 5 times more than the other side in the case of Bush versus McCain in the past year, you're going to have these incredible disparities. Now, people that don't want reform will say they're just for disclosure, that there should be no limits at all, and that is a limit to speech. My group, and I think Larry's group, we're researchers. We really just dig into the records, and we don't advocate legislation or things like that. But if you're asking me, is this money thing out of control? I think it is. And I think that, if you put a person on the moon and bring him back safely, even though we're not doing so well with Mars, but generally we've done a lot of amazing things as a people, and this is not rocket science. If you want to solve this problem, it's very solvable. The question is, will the politicians do it, and will the people insist on it happening? And that part is a big question mark right now.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi. My name is Michael Rock, and I'm from Fremont, Nebraska. I was kind of wondering, what do you think about government-based and equal distribution of tax money to every valid, to every serious politician or candidate? Because right now it's working like that. If, for example, Bush raises $50 million, he always gets a surplus, a bonus to it. And I don't think that this is all right, because...
So are you suggesting, Michael, publicly financed completely? You can't spend any of your own money or contributions?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
That's certainly one of the ideas that's been floated in the reform community. It's actually something that Al Gore talked about earlier this week, his democracy endowment, where people would have $7.1 billion, and this would basically the same kind of fund as you have running the presidential race during the general election. I mean, we do have that system in the general election for presidential. You can't contribute directly to the candidates. But the problem with the system that they set up, is there's not enough money to run a campaign these days, and so there's a need to raise extra money, and hence we have the soft money coming in, unlimited contributions to the parties that are supposed to be helping state and local people, but everyone with a wink and a nod understands that it's actually helping the top of the ticket, the presidential candidates. The question is, if you had a public financing system, would that make it reduce the power of these special people? No question it would do it. If you don't have to deliver on a political IOU, then you have politicians who actually are freer to act as they would on behalf of anyone that they wanted to. But we certainly don't have that system yet. And like Chuck, if I were trying to sit back and decide what are the odds of people who came to power by the current system deciding that we should change the system and have public financing, I'd say not yet, at least.
Michael, would you have any concern about infringing on First Amendment rights of campaign contributors if you created a completely publicly financed system?
There probably would be some problems with this. Probably there would be some cases, some people would try to sue. But I do believe that on the other hand, you have to see that there are people that have that try to get the rights for homeless people and so on, and those homeless people just cannot give that money that let's say oil companies can give, or the NRA. And I do believe that this is a problem.
Mm-hmm. Is a constitutional amendment necessary to overhaul this system?
Senator Bradley, back when he was in the Senate, he and others thought there should be a constitutional amendment. But as a practical matter, if you can't get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate for a compromise version like the McCain-Feingold bill that would just end soft money, how would you get 38 states' legislatures to pass, plus an overwhelming majority? I think constitutional amendment may take 2/3. I'm not sure in the House and Senate. So it may be necessary, but that seems like an even steeper mountain to climb to many reformers than the current mountain.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi.
Erin from Illinois. I was wondering what you thought the role of campaign finance will be in this election. I know some have said that since the common person doesn't really care about what's going on, do you think it will be a big issue in this election, or do you think people will just end up passing it over?
Erin, before we get an answer for you, let me ask you, will you vote in this election? Will you be old enough?
No, I'm not going to be old enough for this election.
Okay, let's pretend. If you were going to vote, would this be an issue that would be of importance to you?
Yes.
And based on that, is there a candidate you find more appealing?
Yes, I'm definitely a Gore supporter. It's not only the campaign finance, but some of his other issues,
right,
the environment, etc. But I find that even his mistakes in the past, he seems to be more open to more change, etc.
Okay.
Well, I think if you had a candidate talk about campaign finance reform and use those words, mm-hmm, it probably wouldn't resonate with a lot of people. If they're asked to say what's the most important problem in America today, only a very small proportion of people say that. But if you say that we have a problem with our democratic system, that the textbook definition of how a democracy works doesn't work anymore, because there's been an interference with money, with people with a lot of money having more say than people who don't have any money, then I think that's a very responsive chord to strike with the American people. I think people respond to that a lot, and I think that was the thing that helped John McCain become a phenomenon. And as in the case of Al Gore, John McCain is no saint when it comes to campaign finance. He's been guilty of many of the things he's criticized other people from. But I think people judged his sincerity to be genuine. And it'll be an interesting question to see whether Al Gore, who's also proposed campaign finance reform, will be perceived in the same way.
Part of the problem is the public is manipulated, of course, by these politicians and their ads. So let's look what happened. The first primary in New Hampshire, voters by 20 points favored, in the Republican side, favored McCain over Bush. Exit polling showed that by a majority of 83 to 13, they thought the person who would clean up politics was McCain. Bush was shocked by this loss, went back to Texas, came out of Texas a few days later with a new slogan, the reformer with results. Now, I'm just stating facts. There is no record of him ever reforming politics in Texas in his 6 years in power. And his program is not seen as terribly serious. He thinks millionaires should still be able to write large checks. But he ran ad after ad after ad in South Carolina, millions of dollars of ads of the reformer with results. He wins South Carolina, and the exit polling showed that a majority of voters found that the biggest reformer was Bush, not McCain, because they'd had this message pummeled into them, reformer, reformer. Everyone uses this R word now. And the public has got to figure out what's real and what's not real, what the truth is and what's not the truth. And that's not easy, since 40% of the American people don't even know the name of the vice president. There's a problem here, and the public has got to get more engaged, I think.
When you throw around that 40% don't know the vice president, I often wonder how many people think George W. Bush is George Bush.
It's true. It's true.
Hi, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just a way we could give ideas on how we could solve the problem and how do other countries handle their campaign finance. How do they raise money for their different elections, and how much money do they spend on their different offices?
That's a good question, a good way to look at it. Maybe if each of you had your choice of best practices around the world, is there a model for democratic elections and money that you would respond with?
I don't know about all the ones. I know that one of the things I think a lot of us, as consumers of the advertising that we get, would certainly appreciate is how in most other countries the election season does not go on for 2 years. It goes on for, you know, a couple of months. You call an election and you have it fairly quickly. That's one way of reducing the amount of money. In a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, the money doesn't go as much to the candidates as it goes to the parties. But one of the interesting things that's taking place is that one of the biggest exports of America right now is our culture, and is in fact our techniques for running political campaigns and the power of lobbyists, for example. There have been a number of scandals in Europe this year and last year that had to do with the enormous power of, first of all, with politicians taking money on the sly that they didn't disclose, with lobbyists having an enormous amount of influence. All the practices that we see in this country are beginning to be exported to other countries, and they're beginning to have scandals as a result of it. Not a hopeful.
Yeah.
Exporting Levi's and scandals across the globe.
The campaigns are shorter, and there's also, but the one bad side of a lot of the foreign stuff is there's less disclosure in most of these cultures. There's less disclosure in England, for example, and many of the countries. I was in South Africa last year, and they have the brand new democracy with Mandela and everything, but the fact is there's no disclosure of where the money is coming from to the parties. And they have so many other issues they're dealing with right now. This is not, frankly, a priority when you have 40% unemployment and other issues facing the country. But there are not a lot of terrific foreign models. There are bits and pieces, shorter campaigns, free airtime in many countries where broadcasting, there's an obligation seen where the airwaves are owned by the citizenry, and yes, candidates can have free time of some sort. That is a concept in some countries. So you have to pick and choose from these countries and come up with your favorite model.
One solution that I'll get you to respond to it, and then our guest, is that some people have advocated is anything goes with full disclosure. So don't try to limit anything. Whatever you want to do, you can do, but post it on a website, let everybody know, so that you, as a voter or prospective voter, can take a look, see how people are getting the money they spend, and decide whether you think it adds up to a viable candidate or not. How would you feel about that process, going in the exact other direction of limiting spending?
With limiting spending, I think you'd find more people running for office, and maybe the richer people saying, well, I don't want to deal with just raising money, I just want to spend my own money. And maybe Steve Forbes wouldn't have ever entered the race if he wouldn't have if he would have had to get out with the people. Maybe he doesn't care to do that kind of things. Maybe you'd see certain people who just want to be president to have the name on their resume.
Okay. Gentlemen, what do you think about going in the other direction? Take off all of the restraints, but require 100% full disclosure.
Personally, I'm not terribly impressed with that. James Madison said, if men were angels, there'd be no need for government. We all know men and women are not angels, and the last unregulated industry in America is the campaign industry and the politicians. They have no one really that's coming after them to prosecute them. If you get in trouble and you're a politician, you pay the fine with campaign money. If they issue a subpoena, it has to be a majority vote of the Federal Election Commissioners. Well, it's 3-3, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. They just can't seem to get a majority on that subpoena vote. And so nothing happens. There is no regulation of politics for all intents and purposes. And so I'm not willing to say that there's one class of individuals in our country that will not have any regulation, will not have any accountability to the public. Because right now that's kind of where it appears to me that it is.
I know you're not in the business of advocating legislation or solutions, but you've done the homework and you have a sense of what you think would work. If you were going to regulate this process, this unregulated process, what would be the areas you would attack that would be most effective?
Well, I mean, call me old-fashioned, but one thing I would do would actually have laws that you could enforce. You know, if you set up a system and it's designed to fail, it's designed to be at loggerheads and never have anything dealt with. If you're regulating politicians, but the politicians control your budget, so you just don't have enough investigators. I mean, you can. I think what I would do. One of the things, none of the reform proposals ever discuss the regulator itself, the enforcement of these laws. It's a joke, and you can propose, you know, till the cows come home about different ideas, but if you don't have any enforcement mechanism, these guys will do whatever they want, and that's sort of what's happening right now.
You know, it's interesting. I think a lot of disclosure is a good thing. Yeah, of course, I think that's a great idea. But the people who talk the most about saying all we need to have is disclosure, these days, this very day, even as we speak, are hiding under the latest loophole in the law, which is something called paragraph 527 in the income tax laws, which allows them to create a group like we saw on Super Tuesday, Republicans for Clean Air. This was a group that came out of nowhere. It's established under the 527 committee and has...
All you aspiring candidates, write that down, 527.
It's the loophole of the year. And what it allows you to do is put unlimited funds from absolutely anybody. And it's like soft money. All the rules are off. Corporations can give, labor unions can give. For that matter, if Saddam Hussein wanted to give $100 million, if the Sicilian Mafia wanted to put $100 million in American elections, they could do it via this 527 committee and never report where the money came from. And you can be completely anonymous. And so many of the people who are saying we don't need to change the laws, all we need to do is have disclosure, have in fact begun using these 527 committees to have unlimited funds at the last minute with absolutely no accountability over even who it was. We know who put those ads on for Republicans for Better Air because this Texas millionaire named Sam Wiley stood up and said it was me. He didn't have to do that. And if he hadn't done that, we would still be scratching our heads wondering where in the world did that money come from. You know, I think disclosure is great, but I wish some of the people who say that that's the solution would live by what they're talking about.
I guess and take $1 million from Saddam Hussein, lose. That's my prediction. Hi, thank you. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name's Justin, and I'm from Fremont, Nebraska. And I was wondering what kind of scams and scandals go on during fundraising for the campaigns, and what are ways we can stop those from happening?
Well, one of them, I suppose you would feel, Larry, was the 527.
527. Another one to look out for, one of the few things that's actually people do get in trouble for, because I certainly agree with Chuck that the Federal Election Commission is hardly a watchdog. If you make a contribution in the name of someone else, if you give $1,000, remember when I first started tracking campaign contributions in Alaska back in the 80s, there was a case of a group of contributions arriving for a state senator in Alaska, all on one day, with people who had occupations like farmhand, dairy worker, mechanic, people who shouldn't have been able to give $1,000 contributions. Well, it turned out that they were actually reimbursed for those contributions by their employers. So that's one of the things that sometimes may happen, and that's clearly illegal. That's one of the things. And the 527s is the new wrinkle where it's completely anonymous, is also, I think, a huge scandal.
There's a bunch of them. I mean, and there are things that aren't scams. It's just the way the system works. But when in our '96 book, The Buying of the President, the biggest contribution was from prison guards who gave Pete Wilson $1.5 million, and both candidates wanted that money, and they had to fill out a questionnaire. And if you didn't answer the questionnaire properly, you didn't get the money. So if you think prison guards are an important job and they should make more money than teachers, and never call them prison guards, they're correctional officers. If you think that all those things, you'll get the money. And you literally, it's taking a test. And the other candidate running against Pete Wilson was upset because she felt she maybe had not answered number 7 correctly. And she called back and they said, sorry, we're giving the money to Pete Wilson. And he becomes governor, and prison guards got the first pay raise in the state of California. And it is 25% more now that they make than teachers. And so there's this jumping through hoops for the donor filling out questionnaires, and that's not a scam, but that's the underside of this system. When you hear someone got all this money, they had to agree to certain things to get the money, and I think that gives most people the creeps, to be honest.
Thanks. Hi.
My name's Patrick from Illinois, and I was wondering if soft money and other things like that have as big of an impact or an influence on state and local elections as they do on elections on the federal level.
Well, I can say that I started looking at this at the state level in Alaska, and they don't have soft money, that very definition of it in different states, although many states have no limits on how much can be given, such as California, where the the correctional officers can give.
You just lost the money, pal. Sorry.
I'll never get that. What I've typically found is that, in fact, there's more direct quid pro quo of donors getting results at the local level and at the state level than there is at the federal level. You just have to go to your own hometown and look at the strip malls or zoning decisions. These are all decisions that are made by local government. And I used to sit in the Anchorage City Council or Borough Assembly and watch them make decisions. And a little bit of a campaign contribution can go a long way in a place like that. Certain industries, such as the gambling industry, for example, casinos and gaming, which has become a huge part of the American economy now in so many places, it's one of the fastest growing industries giving to federal candidates, but that's nothing compared to what they're giving at the state and local level. One of the things you quickly learn when you follow the money in politics is that money follows power. And the industry that's regulated by the politician will give to the politician who can help him out. And I think that's probably even more the case at the state and local level than it is federally.
One conventional wisdom look at this would suggest that, in answer to your question, that there could be even more corruption on the local level because it's less scrutinized than national. Is that a fair assumption?
It's absolutely fair. We've been investigating state legislatures for 2 years. We have the results of our stuff coming out in May. And it's astonishing what's going on under our nose that we don't know about. And when this stuff comes out, Congress is going to look like kindergarten in terms of influence peddling. And I'll spare you all the results, but the bottom line is there's almost no scrutiny. A lot of news organizations don't have reporters in the state capitals anymore watching these people. And billions of dollars have moved as part of devolution to the states now. They have more authority, they have more money, and they have less scrutiny. So that's a recipe for disaster, I think. And so your question's right on point, I'd say.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi. I guess we've been doing all this conversation on corruption and campaign donation.
You want to change the topic to something else than campaign financing?
Well, actually, I was kind of wondering what happens to people who actually violate their limitations. I mean, do they actually get punished? Are they actually getting reprimanded? Or are they just getting a slap on the hand and being like, you're not supposed to do this?
Bad candidate.
Great question. That's, in fact, if you're a political consultant running a campaign, if you're a candidate running for office, that's probably the first question you have is, how can I get away with it? And the reality is, yeah, you pretty well can. First of all, it's really takes some imagination to break the law in American politics today because virtually everything is legal. Second of all, if you do something that's illegal, short of being caught reimbursing direct contributions, which is a serious offense, you're probably going to get away with it. The Federal Election Commission, as Chuck said, has got 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans on issues that really have where one candidate from one of those parties might be embarrassed. They often wind up in a 3-3 tie. They're often going to settle for a dime on the dollar 5, 6, 7 years after the election's taken place. And these politicians all know that when they run for office, so do the political consultants. So the reality is there's a slap on the wrist at most, and it probably is not going to happen until a long ways after the election's end. So that encourages candidates to stretch the law wherever they can do it.
Right.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
I'm Justin from Hastings, Nebraska. And do you believe that campaign finance reform would create an imbalance of power between the two parties as far as Democratic and Republican?
Justin, are you asking this based on some of the things Governor Bush said in response to Senator McCain?
No, not really.
Okay.
I was just curious.
Okay.
Well, I think that any reform that passes is going to have to be agreed upon by both parties. And one of the reasons you haven't had any reform, not the only reason, but one of the reasons for the last 20 years there's been no change and things have gotten worse in the eyes of many people, is that Republicans and Democrats can't agree on your question. So I think that whatever happens here, I think there's so much discussion on this subject that sometime next year, you already have one presidential candidate, Gore, saying the first thing he does in office, the first day, will be campaign finance reform legislation going to Capitol Hill. Bush has not said that, but he may say something more about what his position is in the coming months. Whatever gets proposed, whatever works through the Congress and the executive branch is going to have to probably be equally painful to both parties and their favorite constituents who give money to them. So I don't see that as an issue, frankly. It's really more of an issue of them having the willingness to sacrifice a bit and to say no to the soft money and those kinds of things. Both parties get soft money, and both of them are raising hundreds of millions of dollars in recent years from soft money. And they get it from slightly different places. Republicans don't generally get union money. Democrats do get business money, but not as much as the Republicans. But most of the reform proposals, the ones that are serious, that are bipartisan in terms of co-sponsors, are equally inconvenient to both parties, and that might be why they haven't passed.
Justin, what were you thinking when you asked your question? Did you have in mind that perhaps one party or another would be at a disadvantage?
Yeah, just as far as one party being able to raise more money than the other one.
Did you have a particular party in mind that you thought
No.
could be disadvantaged? Because that was a fairly remarkable response by Governor Bush to John McCain way back in the days of when we had a race in New Hampshire, where Governor Bush, and I'm certainly paraphrasing here, said something to the effect that Mr. McCain's proposals were anti-Republican and that they'd hurt the Republican Party and help the Democratic Party.
Well, that's because the Republican Party has always gotten more money, campaign contributions, than the Democratic Party. So if you get rid of the unlimited contributions, that probably would put financially, in that limited sense, the Republican Party at a disadvantage. One of the really interesting phenomena in campaign finance, the evolution of this whole system, has been that it's always been the case that Republicans have more money, although they always say, and with some justification, that labor unions, who give more than 90% of the money to Democrats, give part of it on the books and a lot of it under the books. There's a lot of things unions can do, so that Republicans will always complain about that. But overall, Republicans get more money. Because of this, a lot of the loopholes in the campaign finance law that we've seen over the years, PACs, other issues, even the 527 committees, have been pioneered by Democrats to get at a better advantage. And it works great for one election cycle, and then the next election cycle, the loophole is picked up by the Republicans, who flood more money than the Democrats ever had. And so it's a long-range strategy that has been a disaster for the Democrats, and yet they keep coming up with new loopholes to try to even that playing field. So it really shows what a morass this is. There's almost nothing you can do that's not going to displease both parties, because they both have an enormous appetite for money so that they can run their election campaigns.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, I'm Kara from Chicago, Illinois. I was wondering, besides the infringement of the First Amendment, what is some other opposition to campaign finance reform?
Well, I mean, that is the principal argument, and a distrust of government, the idea that how can government do anything or regulate anything. The same people that say that First Amendment is an issue, who, incidentally, when I was a reporter at 60 Minutes, I didn't hear any of these people worrying about whether I'd be locked up or there'd be a First Amendment issue for me. Suddenly they've discovered this First Amendment issue, and it makes my heart swell with pride as a former journalist, but I have a feeling that they don't really care about journalists here. But there are, I think a lot of it is a general ideological idea about regulation and about the role of government, and the idea that government should not have a large role in society and should not be telling anyone what to do. And they have invoked those arguments to protect other industries, from the tobacco companies to you name it. And in this instance, it has to do with their own industry, the campaign industry. But they are basically anti-government, is a one way of putting it. They're not in favor of government regulation, I guess you'd say.
Let's turn our focus for a moment to the medium on which we're having this discussion. You brought up free ad time for candidates. This is Broadcasting and Cable Magazine. Ever hear of it? It's an industry trade magazine. And this is the February 28th issue. Cover story says, the cover blurb, Campaign 2000, happy days are here again, and dollars are piling up. And the first paragraph in the story reads, Campaign 2000 has already produced some winners, the broadcast and cable outlets, that will share hundreds of millions of dollars in political spending. So maybe we'll get our guests to talk about what is media's role in all this. You talk about voracious appetite for money that campaigns have. This sounds pretty glib. I mean, it's almost like pigs at the trough. Happy days are here again, celebrating the big bucks rolling in. Make this connection between media and what its proper role might be. This gets to some of the First Amendment questions you were asking earlier, too, about this free ad time.
Well, the most powerful special interest in America is the media, because not only do they give millions of dollars to politicians and parties, and do they have hundreds of lobbyists working for them, but they control whether or not a politician gets his or her face on TV, and that's power. And so they have had a number of things they've lobbied for and fought for. The Telecommunications Act was a giant Christmas tree with all kinds of goodies under it for virtually every industry, including the broadcasters. And they got the whole digital spectrum thing where each network and each TV station got multiple stations that they could raise billions of dollars in new ad revenue. And let's face it,
off the public airwaves.
Off the public airwaves. And in New Hampshire, there is actually a TV studio named after Steve Forbes because he ran so many ads. They were making so much money from Steve Forbes. So, I mean,
the Steve Forbes network, all Forbes all the time.
Exactly. And so let's face it, the media is involved in this thing. The media is making money from all of this and from all these ads. The media, the broadcast industry, is also adamantly opposed to giving free airtime to any candidate. I think that they're direct participants in this debate, and you'll notice the last time the McCain-Feingold bill came up in the Senate, there was no mention of free airtime. No politician wants to bring it up because they know it has no chance because they're not willing to go up against the powerful broadcast industry. So they are a direct part of this whole discussion. And, you know, there's another dirty little secret of American politics. Coverage of politics in this country by the news is half what it was in 1992. If you're a politician, you have to buy ads because you're never going to get on the tube otherwise unless you buy an ad from these people. So the only way to get on the tube is to pay them to run your face. And that's a little scary.
All these campaign budgets you're analyzing across the country, is the cost of television, is that the #1 culprit in driving up the cost of campaigning?
It's one of the culprits, but it's not the only culprit. And another one of the dirty little secrets about these campaigns is that a lot of the money that candidates raise is not spent on communicating with voters under any medium. It's used to enrich their own lifestyle. And this is another area that, because this has never been computerized at the federal level and is even more obscure at the local and state level, a lot of politicians haven't really paid a price for this.
What do you mean enrich their own lifestyle?
Well, pay for limousines, pay for meals at restaurants, also create things like a political machine at home, buy funeral flowers, do picnics at the 4th of July for your constituents, build up a political machine by spreading some of the money around back in the district. This does go on to varying levels with different members of Congress. And interestingly, one of the things that we're going to see starting in 2001 with the next election cycle is that all candidates for the House of Representatives, at least, not the Senate, they've exempted themselves, but the House have to file electronically both their contributions and their expenditures. So we're going to have for the first time an easier way to track what they spend their money on. If you're running for statewide office or for federal office, television is going to be a major component of your money. There's no question about that. If you're running for Congress in a place like Chicago, where there's 15 or 20 local congressmen in the area, it doesn't make any sense to run ads on television, so you're going to spend your money elsewhere. So media is part of the reason they raise the money, but there are other reasons as well. And the more we look at that, I think the more shocked we're going to be.
What percentage of the presidential candidates' budgets go to television?
I think it's 30 or 40%, something like that.
So it is the big chunk.
Yes, I think at that level it is the biggest part.
Let me ask you, before we go to your question, if I could ask for a poll, a flash poll, raise your hands. How many of you would advocate networks turning over free airtime to candidates during campaigns? Okay, looks like a majority. Let me ask the dissenters. How many of you are against that? You think that networks shouldn't be forced to give free airtime away to candidates? A couple people. And then any undecideds in the group? We have to be fair here in the tabulation of the votes. And our undecided happens to be standing at the microphone right now. So if you could introduce yourself.
I'm Amy from Fremont, Nebraska.
Amy, why are you ambivalent about this? What are you thinking about it?
I don't know. I think if candidates want to be on TV or running for president or whatever, they should pay for it. They shouldn't have to give it to them free. But then also that's another way of advertising, so they should get it for free. I don't know.
No, I know it's tough. That's why we like to hear from the undecideds. We want to see where the issues are. But you have a question of your own, I'm guessing, or you were just hanging out there?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
Is there any way to trace those who've made donations of soft money?
You mean to find out if Saddam Hussein did give money under 527?
You can trace, because they're required to disclose it, who gave the soft money. But what you can't trace is how it gets spent. It's virtually impossible. It's squishy. You don't. It's going into all these state committees. There's something like 60 or 70 state committees just in each party all over the nation. So they'll transfer money from one account to another. And trying to find that, trying to track that is a nightmare. No one tracks any of this better than Larry, but is that your impression?
Yeah, there's a lot of interstate commerce in campaign contributions, if you will. They move it around a lot. But in fact, you can trace who the biggest donors are. You can go to our website, www.opensecrets.org, and click the button that says soft money and find out who the biggest donors are.
That's Open Secrets, not Victoria's Secrets.
Not Victoria's Secrets, no, that's a different secret. That's the third dirty little secret.
Lingerie gets a laugh. I mean, come on.
But you can do that and find out, both you can find out who's giving the most overall and how much have they split to the Democrats and Republicans. And one of the wonderful, interesting things you find is that some companies give a little bit to both parties. I mean, you split it roughly 50-50. You can also look up your own state and find out who's giving the most from your own state in soft money. Now, that's the soft money that goes to the parties. That's the disclosed stuff. If they're dealing with these 527 committees, then that's a black hole. Nobody knows where that money's coming from or how much is being given. So we can see some of it, and that you can get on the website.
And you could add a category for soft money and squishy money now, too. What is your website, just by the way, before we forget?
Publicintegrity.org, O-R-G. It's pretty straightforward. And we have profiles of all the presidential candidates, including how many times they have run afoul of the campaign finance laws themselves from federal election records. So we've got top 25 career patrons, if you want to see their 25 best friends in the world. And if you want to see their advisors to presidential candidates, we have a couple hundred people that have been around these candidates getting close to power, and some of them will be the next U.S. officials. And so we have a lot of that data for voters available.
That's opensecrets.org, and we can make that clear. I don't want to be responsible for people trying to order the Wonder Bra from Center for Responsive Politics or something like that. All right, go ahead, please.
My name is Jessica. I'm from Illinois. Campaigns, especially on the national level, are very expensive, and if legislation that would limit campaign spending were passed, how would candidates be able to reach the voters to the extent that they are right now? I know that the concept of free airtime has much opposition. Are there any other concepts?
Did you vote for or against the free ad time?
I voted for.
You're for. Okay. So that would be one answer to your partial answer to your question.
Actually, the Supreme Court has ruled that you can put a limit on how much people give to campaigns, except the candidates themselves who can give as much, but you cannot put a limit on how much they can spend. But there have been attempts to nonetheless encourage candidates not to spend money by giving matching funds to I mean, if your opponent, first of all, you have an allowance for everyone that they could get from public money. And this has never passed at the federal level, but it has passed in several states. Maine, it passed in Massachusetts, it passed in by a very narrow margin in Arizona, and it's on the ballot in a couple more states this year. You can't force them to do it, but you can have incentives such as, for example, if you run and you agree to live by these limits and someone else comes up and runs unlimited money against you, then you get a little bit extra money to run against it. So I think free airtime, frankly, is one of the important elements of that. Some kind of, I mean, members of Congress have franking privileges where they can send free mail. There might be other mechanisms of doing that as well. But also this, the old idea of people knocking on doors wouldn't be such a bad idea. I think people would like that. And I think, frankly, voters appreciate a candidate who's not a spendthrift and who, can get the message out. But the reality is it's a tough job to get your message out without any money at all.
Well, and the larger the race, the less practical knocking on doors becomes. That's
true.
Right. Thanks. Hi, go ahead, please.
I'm Ashley from Hastings, Nebraska, and I was just wondering, Do you think campaign finance reform puts a limit on our freedom of speech?
What do you think?
I really don't see where exactly they're coming from, because I've just heard that people, or the people that are against the campaign finance reform feel that it's a violation of our freedom of speech. And so I was just wondering where they're coming from and what you thought of it, I
Well,
guess.
what about that? Isn't this just another form of democracy?
Well, the problem is we have this idea, a quaint notion, that we have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The problem is if a certain segment of society has millions of dollars they want to dump into elections, and the average citizen, 96% of the American people, don't give a dime to any politician, and a good number of people don't have extra money to give to anybody, then some people are more equal than others, and there is also the corrupting influence of money, which the Supreme Court has acknowledged. There is one. So I think there is a conundrum, and the biggest problem here is with gazillionaires who want to spend as much as they want. That's where you have a real problem here, because what do? Do you say to a Steve Forbes, yes, you have $400 million, but you can only spend $5 million to run for president? Right now, the Supreme Court is not willing to grant that change or make that change, and Steve Forbes would cry that his free speech was limited, even though he owns a magazine. Just kidding.
Is there anything, Larry, now that is different or worse? Because one view of this is it's always been this way. Landowners got to vote. Is there something that's particularly pernicious now?
I think there is. I mean, I think the more money that gets in elections, the more dependent members of Congress or politicians at every level are dependent, not just on the voters, but on those special people, the cash constituents. They're always walking the hills of Congress with one looking behind their shoulder, looking by one shoulder. They're always afraid there's going to be some millionaire in their district that's going to run against them, and therefore they have to raise as much money as possible. And the first place that they go to raise that money is the industries that they oversee on their committees in Congress. A lot of the work that's done in Congress and a lot of the lobbyists, they don't hang out on the floor of the House and Senate as much as they hang out in the committee rooms. This is where there's not as much public scrutiny of what's going on. This is where decisions get made that make a huge difference in the bottom lines for every industry in the country. And that's where members go to get their money. So I think it's a lot more pernicious now, because you have to have the money to be heard. And I do think, I mean, one of the worst places we've seen this, many times California is always the starting place for trends. And in the last gubernatorial race in California, there was more money on television than ever before, and there was less coverage of the race on television than ever before.
Gentlemen, on the network that abhors sound bites, I'm going to ask you for one. I only have 10 seconds left to each of you, and it relates to the program these students are participating on this week. Close-up programs about getting young people in particular, but all people, more involved in the democratic process. Does this campaign finance question suppress or create voter apathy? I just need a quick thought on this.
I think negative ads are designed with one reason in mind: keep the voters from going to the polls. I think it's designed to keep the polls down. Follow where the money's coming from.
Charles Lewis?
I think if you're talking about who controls this country and who makes the decisions, there's no more exciting issue involving politics. So no matter what you care about, the environment, education, any subject you care about involves money. And if you want to get inside and find out what's going on, you follow it.
Charles Lewis, Larry Makinson, thank you. Thank you for a terrific group of questions and comments today. Hope you enjoy the rest of your week while you're here. Next week, we'll be back here in the museum, and we're going to be looking at the campaign again, this time from the perspective of candidates trying to get their message out through the media. Hope you'll join us then. For all of us here at the museum and the Close-Up Foundation, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching. Tell us we're clear in a second.